What if it was always overcast?
Yes, what if it was always overcast? So I wanted to look, because when I heard this question, I wanted to, my mind immediately went to sundials and like keeping time with sundials. So I wanted to focus sort of on time and how we keep time and the history of keeping time. And like, would it develop the same way that it did if we couldn't see the sun and stuff? So going back, the oldest known sundial is from 1500 BC in ancient Egypt, and a sundial is known as it's known as a shadow clock. There are different types of shadow clocks. So
Why would you ever change the name from shadow clock to anything else? Shadow clock is the coolest goddamn name I've ever heard.
Shadow clock is like the more overall term for it, and then a sundial is a type of shadow clock. Shadow
clock is like the Marvel villain I didn't know I wanted.
What would his power be?
It doesn't matter.
Dark.
He's gonna be dressed up all in black, and he's gonna be super smart and super badass, and he's gonna get at least 3 movies.
He's gonna have a large clock on his chest.
He's gonna have a sundial on his chest.
Pretty much it.
He's the inspiration was someone put a shark suit on backwards, and the fins cast a shadow.
They're like, oh, we can tell time with that too. And another type of shadow clock, also in ancient Egypt, are obelisks. So they built like large, like elongated structures upward, and they use the shadow of that to tell time. And those date back as early as 3500 BC. Now, obviously, if it's overcast and there's really no directional sun, then sundials and shadow clocks are kind of useless. But they did have some alternative methods in ancient Egypt that they used for that case, because they still needed to tell time at night and when it was cloudy, because even though it's not overcast all the time, it still was sometimes overcast. So other methods that they used were, or one of the main methods that they used was water clocks. So basically just like a vessel that's holding water, and that have some sort of way for the water to flow out, and then they know how fast that the water flows out, and they can see how much has flowed out.
But how do you know when to fill the water clock?
So it was more of like a stopwatch sort of thing, I guess. So like you can, or I guess like an alarm clock, you can set it for a certain amount of time and then it runs out.
Yeah, I know. It's still useful. But what if you just go back to check your water clock and it's empty? You don't know what time it is anymore.
Yeah. And a whole bunch of other civilizations adopted the water clock as well. And Plato actually invented an alarm water clock. So like the idea was, I guess he had lead balls and the...
Sorry.
Well-known fact about Plato.
Yeah.
He's got a stiff upper lip and lead balls.
And water would flow into some sort of vessel thing, and it would make the balls float up. And eventually it would like overflow, and the balls would like fall into a different thing, and it would like clang, and that would wake people up. There was another version of this where the water flow forced air through a whistle, and that was another version of the alarm clock. And as history advanced, water clocks became more elaborate, and there's actually a modern version of the water clock, or relatively modern. It was invented in 1979, and it's called the Bernard Gittin Time Flow Clock. It's actually pretty cool. I saw a picture of it, and there's like all these siphons and vessels and like weird shapes, but then there's like time markers on the side, and you can tell exactly what time it is based on that. It was pretty cool. So that's the water clock. That was one method that they used. They also had candle clocks. So the same idea. They know how fast that the candle burns down, and they can measure that. Incense clocks, also same idea.
Man, the superhero names are getting further and further off the mark.
Yeah, no one's gonna want to read about candle clock.
Or definitely not incense clock.
Yeah. And there are hourglasses. So hourglass is the same idea as a water clock, but just sand instead of water. But yeah, those are some different methods. And then eventually we got to geared clocks. So the first geared clock was invented in the 11th century by an Arab engineer. I'm going to butcher this name, but it was Ibn Khalif al-Maradi. And his geared clock used mechanisms of water clocks in combination with like a gear system. And that was the first geared clock. And then eventually we got to mechanical clocks that were wound. So they need to like wind them about twice a day. And they were built by European Catholic monks, mainly because they required accurate timekeeping in order to adhere to their strict prayer and work schedules. So those are mechanical clocks. So over time, clocks became more and more precise, and eventually we got to atomic clocks.
The best kind of clock. Back on the superhero name train right here. I'm just waiting for you to say words followed by clock and decide if they're good superheroes. That's all I'm doing now.
I think atomic clock would be a hero rather than a villain, though. Shadow clock is a villain.
Atomic Clock could be a villain.
It could be. I'm going to say it's a hero.
Kurt's like, this is my IP. Back off.
Yeah. So the atomic clock actually standardized the length of a second, because prior to the atomic clock, all measurements of time were based on the length of day, and the length of the day varies depending on what time of year it is. So we didn't really have a definitive like unit of measurement for time. But with the atomic clock, we were able to define it, and the official definition of a second is the duration of 9,192,631,770 periods of the radiation corresponding to the transition between the two hyperfine levels of the ground state of the cesium-133 atom at temperatures of 0 Kelvin. So,
Gosh.
if you ever wanted to know why we have the second, that's why.
Because it's 90 math of those.
Yeah. But this is basically, it turned the second into not variable anymore and made it constant. So, and that's basically brought us to the point where we are now. We still use that as the definition of the second. Now, if it was always overcast, obviously we can't see the sun and we wouldn't have sundials anymore. But pretty much everything else that I said has nothing to do with the sun at all. So, I mean, we wouldn't have sundials, but we'd still be able to keep time, and I think it would still develop the same pretty much. But next I want to look at why, like, would we still divide it into 24 hours in a day? And to look at that, I had to figure out why we do that in the first place. Again, that dates back to the ancient Egyptians. So they counted on a base 12 system as opposed to our base 10 system. So we have base 10 probably because we have 10 fingers. It's easy to count on our 10 fingers. But people think that they counted on a base 12 system because they counted their knuckles excluding their thumbs, because they counted their knuckles using their thumb. So you have 4 fingers other than your thumb, and each finger has 3 knuckles on it. So they counted a base 12 system, and they divided their day into 12 parts and their night into 12 parts. So they divided into 24 divisions. So that's sort of where the 24 hours stems from. Why do we have minutes and seconds? Because those are based on a different system. They're based on a base 60 system. So that dates back to the ancient Sumerians. And they used a base 60 number system. We don't really know why exactly they did that. There are a few theories, but we're not really sure.
I mean, here in America with our imperial units, we can't really talk shit about this base 60 system.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the theories is that it's pretty easy, like it's divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So it makes it easily divisible by things. That's just one theory. But they came up with like the 360 degrees in a circle, and they used that largely for navigation, but that also translated eventually into time. So that became the minute and the second. So we've covered hours, minutes, and seconds. Days, I guess, days is pretty easy to understand. It's just when the sun goes up and when the sun goes down.
Yeah, even if it's overcast, you can still tell when it's daytime.
Yeah, you can still tell that it's bright and dark. But like the minutes and the seconds don't really change. They're not affected by the overcast thing. So next, I wanted to look at months and years because we've looked at everything else. So the early tracking of years dates back to prehistoric structures called megaliths, or basically just like stone structures from the Stone Age. Stonehenge is an example of megalith, but it's that's like a more modern version relatively. Megaliths date back to as early as the Neolithic period, so that's like the end of the Stone Age, about 12,000 years ago. And they use the they were used to track the solar year, so based on the sun. Now, the oldest calendar was from the Mesolithic period, about 10,000 years ago, and that tracked the lunar calendar. So the idea of the month was developed also, again, by the ancient Sumerians, and they used a lunar month. They based it on every time that they saw a new moon, they started a new month. So that was like sort of one system. The Persians were one of the first to use like a solar calendar. So there are lots of variations of different types of calendars, but they all pretty much rely on the sun and the moon. Now, in our overcast situation, obviously we can't see the sun and the moon, so we don't have those patterns, but we still do have patterns. So we, even though it's overcast, we can still... What was that?
Sorry, that was a conch outside my
Yeah,
window.
passing clown, you know.
I'm gonna get murdered tonight, but that's okay. I'm here right now. I'm here and having a great time with my buds.
That was like such a clear honk.
Clown came back. Clown hero's talking shit.
That's Shadow Clock coming to get you.
Shadow Clock's coming. Shadow Clock and his band of clowns is coming to get me.
What was I saying?
So there were patterns that are not the sun and the moon.
So we still have patterns that aren't the sun and the moon. Mainly climate. So obviously it gets colder during the winter and it gets hotter during the summer. And like the length of the days would also get shorter and longer, and we'd notice that. So I think we'd still recognize these patterns, and we would develop months based on these patterns. I don't know if they would follow the same conventions or not. I think they would be mainly based on farming seasons. That makes the most sense to me. But I do think, because historically calendars have focused on a 12 or 13 month system, and I think we might mirror the 12 based time system that the Egyptians were using, because we use that already for hours. So I think we'd still have 12 months. Even though we can't see the lunar cycles, I think that would still stay the same for the most part. But what about our numbers system for the years? So the numbering system for our years is based on Christianity. So BC stands for before Christ, AD stands for Anno Domini, I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's Latin for in the year of the Lord. So like everything at BC is like 1 and then on. So we're 20 right now. We're 2020 BC, not BC, AD. But again, that has nothing to do with the sun and the moon. So obviously, the numbering would pretty much stay the same.
I thought you were gearing up to say, if it was overcast, we wouldn't have had Jesus.
I'm not going to make that bold claim.
Because you see, in the scripture, it says, when the sun rises for the third, and it wouldn't because it's overcast.
I mean, maybe, I don't know. So you've probably noticed a pattern with all this stuff, even though it's overcast, and some stuff does rely on the sun and the moon. We have other ways to do it, and a lot of it doesn't rely on the sun and the moon at all. So one of the big differences, we wouldn't have sundials, but that really doesn't matter in the large scheme of things. And it might take longer for us to develop time, or it might actually be faster, because we don't have the ambiguity of what system you have to use. Like, some people were using the sun, some people are using the moon. We don't have that problem anymore. Everyone's just using the same thing. They're probably just going to be using the same light-dark cycle of day-night and the hot-cold cycle of winter-summer. So our divisions will probably end up the same, because we're using the same number systems and we have the same cycles, and it'll still be, for us, July 2nd, 2020.
The year of Shadow Clock and the Clowns.
That was a clip from Absurd Hypotheticals, the podcast where we answer dumb hypothetical questions. For the full episode, click on the link in the description.